She saw her marshalling the children of the poor into pews. She would come in at the head of the procession from the Sunday school, exactly 5 minutes before the choir, and get her boys and girls neatly fitted into their allotted seats, and down on their little knees in their preliminary prayer, and up again on their feet just as, to the swelling organ, the vestry door opened, and the choir and clergy, big with the litanies and commandments they were presently to roll out, emerged. She had a sad face, yet she was evidently efficient. The combination used to make Mrs. Wilkins wonder, for she had been told by Mellersh, on days when she had only been able to get place, that if one were efficient, one wouldn't be depressed, and if one does one's job well, one becomes automatically bright and brisk. About Mrs. Arbuthnot there was nothing bright and brisk, though much in her way with the Sunday school children that was automatic. But when Mrs. Wilkins turned from the window, caught sight of her in the club, she was not being automatic at all, but was looking fixedly at one portion of the first page of the Times, holding the paper quite still, her eyes not moving. She was just staring, and her face, as usual, was the face of a patient and disappointed Madonna. Mrs. Wilkins watched her a minute, trying to screw up the courage to speak to her. She wanted to ask her if she had seen the advertisement. She did not know why she wanted to ask her this, but she wanted to. How stupid not to be able to speak to her. She looked so kind. She looked so unhappy. Why couldn't two unhappy people refresh each other on their way through this dusty business of life by a little talk, real, natural talk, about what they felt, what they would have liked, what they still tried to hope? And she could not help thinking that Mrs. Arbuthnot, too, was reading that very same advertisement. Her eyes were on the very part of the paper. Was she, too, picturing what it would be like? The colour, the fragrance, the light, the soft lapping of the sea among the little hot rocks? Colour, fragrance, light, sea, instead of Shaftesbury Avenue, and the wet omnibuses, and the fish department at Schoolbreads, and the tube to Hampstead, and the dinner, and the tomorrow the same, and the day after the same, and always the same. Suddenly, Mrs. Wilkins found herself leaning across the table. "Are you reading about the medieval castle and the wisteria?" she heard herself asking. Naturally, Mrs. Arbuthnot was surprised, but she was not half so surprised as Mrs. Wilkins was at herself for asking. Mrs. Arbuthnot had not yet, to her knowledge, set eyes on the shabby, lank, loosely put-together figure sitting opposite her, with its small freckled face and big grey eyes almost disappearing under a smashed-down, wet-weathered hat, and she gazed at her for a moment without answering. She was reading about the medieval castle and the wisteria, or rather had read about it 10 minutes before, and since then had been lost in dreams of light, of colour, of fragrance, of the soft lapping of the sea among the little hot rocks. "Why do you ask me that?" she said in her grave voice, for her training of and by the poor had made her grave and patient. Mrs. Wilkins flushed and looked excessively shy and frightened. "Oh, only because I saw it too, and I thought perhaps, I thought somehow," she stammered. Whereupon Mrs. Arbuthnot, her mind being used to getting people into lists and divisions from habit considered, as she gazed thoughtfully at Mrs. Wilkins, under what heading, supposing she had to classify her, she could most properly be put.